All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Mindgasms podcast. Going to talk to Trevor Aleo today, another member of Mixed Mental Arts, as most of my guests are, and he's a teacher. So we're going to talk about topics like education and mixed mental arts because I'm a tutor, so similar there. So yeah, we can start off whatever you want to start off with there, Trevor.
Sure. So I guess I'll kind of jump into how I fell into mixed mental arts and how it ended up aligning really well with, I guess, some of my curriculum. So
Sure.
I was falling down a YouTube rabbit hole, which was pretty par for the course for me. And I stumbled
Me
on
too.
Mark Blythe's videos. And from watching some Mark Blythe videos, I stumbled on some of the episode of with him and Hunter. And it in addition to all the great things that Mark Blythe brings to the table, I love the way that Hunter talked about the power of stories and narratives, and in an episode that dealt with a topic like economics, which is something that is still kind of opaque to me no matter how much time I spend trying to wrap my brain around it. Hearing conversations and potential solutions, like when they were talking about the partisan divide, like America needs a more aligned story, a story that's not about partisanship, and like how narratives can kind of shape our understanding of ourselves and our world. And I was just like, whoa, that is incredibly powerful. So from there, I just basically binge listened to as many episodes as I could get my hands on, read as many of the books as I could, and at the same time, I was in charge of designing I was like our team lead for 12th graders. So, and like, I'm not sure what the Canadian setup is. It's like our seniors, like right before you go to college or university.
Yeah, it's
Um,
it's similar here. High school is grade 9 to 12.
yeah, so
Yeah.
same with us.
Yeah.
And a lot of it is of the curriculum is geared towards having kids understand like the cultural implications, ramifications of literature, like how is literature a reflection of culture, and it's like British lit specifically.
Okay.
And it was interesting because I kind of realized that like my students didn't even really know what culture was because they've never really talked about it.
Oh.
So they're reading these old dusty British tomes, and I'm like, what does this reveal about British culture? And they're like, I don't know, and I don't care. What is culture exactly? I ended up kind of running them through a jury rigged belt system, um, where they were doing the activities, and it gave us a really good framework for just understanding what it means to be human, and what the role that culture plays within that. So I find that a lot of times when it comes to, I'm an English teacher, and a lot of times, we give kids this really old, dusty book that was written by like a dead white guy 300 years ago. And we're like, okay, 15-year-old kid, take this really hard to understand text, read it by yourself, and then from it, glean the complexities of the human experience, and then write a 10-page paper on it. And they're like, I can't do this. What is happening? How am I supposed to, understand what Shakespeare like has to say or wants to say
Yeah.
about love when the closest I've come is like a middle school dance where like I held a girl's hand for
Yeah.
5 seconds.
And why
So
should I care about this? How is this relevant to my life?
exactly. So what was kind of powerful is like by talking about like giving the kids a framework to understand their humanity within first, and then seeing how text can illuminate those ideas was a super powerful switch. Because then instead of like playing like guess what the symbol is or guess what the message is, they get a preview of the message up front, and I presented it into them the contexts that are relevant. Like I have them listen to a few of the Mixed Mental Arts podcast episodes. I have them watch like an episode of Black Mirror or read a like young adult fiction book, and then after that, how do those ideas look in the
That's
canon? So
that's
like
pretty awesome homework, especially watching Black Mirror, listening to Mixed Mental Arts.
absolutely, that was our last unit that we did. So it kind of just opened my eyes to a lot of the different things that were outside the normal academic realm, that I could be bringing to kids and talking to kids about while we were reading sort of and going through the traditional curriculum. So I guess that's kind of like intro to it.
Okay. Yeah, that's a great way to go about doing it. I personally I haven't like directly put the practices of mixed mental arts into what I do for tutoring. Although I guess you could kind of say I put a few sort of related concepts into it. Like one thing that I do related to what Hunter and Katie O'Brien wrote about in The Straight A Conspiracy is I try to have this mindset with whatever kid I'm teaching that if someone's having trouble learning like math, for example, it's not that they're dumb and they're incapable of doing math and that sort of thing. It's that you just have to make it like more interesting and make it try to help them understand the process of actually getting the right answer. Like often I find if I kind of explain the concept of like deconstruct the questions into different parts for one thing and figure those out separately, and then try to get them to understand the process of figuring out the question, then usually if I ask them how to get the answer rather than what the answer is, it helps them get more right answers because they're not just doing this mindless repetition. They're actually starting to understand the process better. And importantly, relating it back to the ideas in Straight A Conspiracy, it's not that they're dumb, it's that they need to look at the questions a little more differently.
Yeah, and like the problem that everyone in education faces is the fact that we have the systems and structures in place that are obsessed with like what is the answer, what is the correct equation, what is the correct whatever, and nobody pays attention to how and why. And that's both the teachers and the students. Like teachers are thinking about what they have to teach, what's on the test, what the criteria for their evaluations are. Students are thinking about what grade can I get, what's the answer, what do I need to say so the teacher thinks I'm smart, and nobody is thinking about how do you reach those answers, and then more importantly, why ask the questions that we are asking in the first place. So a
Yeah.
lot of times education just becomes this performative thing, and for those kids who have been bad or have struggled previously with the performative aspect of it, because maybe they have a different way of thinking, or maybe they've bought into the narrative that they are dumb or they can't do it. They kind of end up getting left behind because everyone just keeps asking them what is the answer? What are you doing? What can you do to do better? As opposed to like, how can you approach this problem? How can you leverage what you already know from other subjects or in other areas to apply that to this new situation? And that's why I really enjoyed Straight A Conspiracy. Is it opened up some doors to have conversations with your kids like about their cognition, and like how to be reflective, not just about like what you are learning, but like the learning process itself. And I think that like demystifying how we learn is a really powerful lesson for kids, because it doesn't become this magic thing where it's like Timmy's good at math because he has the math gene, or Susie's good at stories because like she's like a literary wizard. It's like, no, like there are like processes that you can practice and skills you can hone to be just as good as Timmy or Susie at whatever topic you want.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, you made me think of a few things there. Like, for example, with one of my students that I was tutoring in math, he was really fascinated with the history of World War II. So when we were doing math questions, he would always kind of like bring up something about Hitler or World War II or how horrible the Nazis are to kind of like distract from the questions. So I started kind of doing this thing where if you do these questions all the way through, then we can talk about World War II for 10 minutes at the end of my hour. So and then that in
Uh,
combination with trying to get him to like explain how to get the answers rather than just tell me what the answers are, both of those helped a lot too.
So do you tutor like across content? Like you do, like you work with one kid on like a few different subjects?
Yeah, well, usually I tutor like one student on one subject, and then I often
Mhm.
have like one or more students in different subjects. Um, oh yeah, another thing I was thinking about in relation to what you said is I was just telling this to the mother of one of my students yesterday. I was saying I think the reason that there are so many students for me to tutor is that in the education system, a large part of it is designed to it's like a product of the Victorian era, designed to make kids be good little automatons and factory workers. Like, if okay, kids who just want to go outside and play, let's sit in a desk for 8 hours and all just do this mindless repetition, because that'll uh encourage kids to learn and make learning exciting and make them love school.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, like, and now, in addition to just like the obvious shortcomings of like that industrialized model, you have kids who have endless entertainment and endless content streaming right into a magical box in their pocket. So it's like a lot of teachers are frustrated because they're like, why aren't kids paying attention? Like, why don't kids see the utility in what I'm doing? Like, kids these days. But it's like, why are we surprised that kids are, even not that the ones before found it amazingly enjoyable, but why are we finding now, it's just right, it shouldn't be surprising now that like kids are struggling even more because they know that entertainment is at their fingertips, and all they have to do is reach into their pocket. So like teachers that aren't thinking or considering ways to make what they're doing more engaging are struggling even more within that archaic system, because the system is set up to be boring and unengaging, but to be a vehicle to deliver content. But kids are like, I got content on my phone and it's not boring and disengaging. So like, what are you bringing to the table? And I've noticed a lot of teachers, and myself included sometimes, do feel like frustration at that. Like the way like technology is literally changing the way that we behave, the way that we think, the way that we interact with each other. And that's just an added layer of complication on top of all the other systems and structures that have been there before.
Yeah. And like you were saying earlier too, kids learn in different ways. It's not all the same ways. Like, maybe some are more visual learners, maybe some are more verbal learners. Like, that's one of the reasons that people are looking for tutors too, because like a lot of the time, if if I'm helping a kid, it's like they're not understanding the concept, but then if I explain it to them, they understand it, and they might do bad in class because they're not good at taking tests or something like that, or maybe kind of like I said, they like, if I'm explaining a math concept, if I like draw it out in the form of a picture or something like that, that might that might work better. And they're like, it's part of this sort of industrialized system, as you said, is just expecting everyone to be able to just, okay, I look at the chalkboard, I listen to the teacher, I write, I answer these questions, I immediately understand the concept without having to have it reiterated or anything like that. Even that idea of the system, like, I when I love learning and I'm learning stuff all the time as a supposedly fully formed adult, but I still usually need to learn basic concepts like at least a few times, or maybe even a handful of times over before I get them.
Yeah, and then that's one of the great ironies is that like if you were to ask a teacher the way that they like to learn or the way that they are experiencing, times when they're trying to grow or educate themselves, like the very things that they like and dislike, the same goes for their students. And it's kind of ironic a lot of times when teachers get professional development, someone will be giving a sit and get lecture about the dangers of you doing sit and get lectures in their class. So like, but I think that's part of the problem is like, as teachers obviously and understandably want to like update the education paradigm, and there's a lot of movement towards like doing project-based learning and inquiry-based learning, and just generally kind of changing things up in terms of like what education looks like. But at the same time, like as a public school teacher, while I'm trying to update and be more progressive, with my pedagogy, I'm always facing the fact that at the end of the year, they're taking so we have AP, which is like honors on steroids through College Board, and guess how many millions of dollars they make from all the tests and supplementary study materials they get? Education industrial complex, enter.
Okay.
But
Yeah, we
like
have we have that here too. Like, when I was in high school, the quote unquote smart kids would go into the AP classes because they were like more advanced.
Yeah, and we have the same thing. So like while teachers are being told to update how they teach and to be more progressive, they're still beholden to the results of a very traditional linear test. So that's kind of like an interesting, I guess, struggle and double think that a lot of teachers are caught in. Like I want to update and be more progressive, but like I'm nervous about my test scores. So that's kind of like where I think a lot of teachers get trapped in this, like well, how do I do what I know is best for kids while also being beholden to the systems and structures that I'm operating within, as a public school teacher.
Yeah, yeah, I bet that's challenging because, like, for me as a tutor, I obviously don't have anywhere near that many rules that I have to follow. I usually just go to the house of the student I'm tutoring, and I can sort of teach any way I want to, as long as if they have homework, basically stick to the questions, but I can do that sort of thing, anything in any way I want. And then also, since most of my students tend to be pretty short term, there's not really that much of an incentive to design any sort of long-term detailed plans or something like that. And then also long-term detailed plans that are compatible with several different students, to at the least, I'm sure. Like how big are your class sizes on average?
So like my class sizes are like 30 kids,
Yeah, that's a
like
lot.
31 kids. Yeah.
Yeah.
But like there are solutions out there though. Like on the one hand, I'm sympathetic and I feel the crunch, of just being in a modern classroom. But on the other hand, there are people out there that have innovative, cool ideas that work. I was thinking, you keep using the term concept. And this year I stumbled onto something called conceptual understanding, concept-based learning. Um, Totally recommend you check it out. So there's a book right now that I've been reading and rereading called Tools for Teaching Conceptual Understanding. It's by an author named Julie Stern, and what her whole method is around is understanding individual concepts and then exploring like how they look in relationship to each other. So like in my last unit, we're talking about it was like our media literacy unit. So we talked about like what is the relationship between bias, culture, and narratives. So like you talk about like what bias is on an individual level, you talk about what culture is on an individual level, and that's why I use a lot of mixed mental arts materials. And they talk about what narratives are on an individual level. And then you give the kids different examples, different texts, have them reading a lot of news articles from different ideological viewpoints. And as they read each of those, they had to understand and articulate like what role does culture, cognition, and narrative play in each of those. So I'd be like, what story or narrative is this, journalist trying to tell? What culture are they trying to appeal or pander to? What cultures are you a member of that will affect your perception of it? And then which of the cognitive biases, I took the cognitive biases from Adam Hansen's book, How to Outsmart Your Instincts. Which are you falling prey to? Which are the which ones could the author potentially being falling prey to? So just kind of like getting them to explore how different concepts look, and like the real secret sauce would be, and I'm trying to do this next year, is exploring how concepts look across content. So like we're going to be looking at like what does justice look like in literature, and then another class is going to be like our 12th grade government class is going to be like, what does justice look like, in our local government system? So it's like you're having a conversation about these concepts across context. So like you could talk, because systems is so easy, you could be reading 1984 and talking about systems in English. And then in history, you're looking at different economics or governmental systems. And then in science, you're looking at like the water cycle as a system. And then in health class, you're looking at like the body and all the different interconnected systems within it. So it's like really kind of like a philosophical conceptual exploration of these ideas across content, and like finding Julie's work on that, and then taking all the stuff that I've been learning and thinking about in mixed mental arts and kind of smushing them together into a big gumbo has been like my big project this year. And it's been really cool to kind of take the concepts that I learned about in mixed mental arts and then, oh, cool, now I have a framework that I can pitch them to kids with. So
Oh, that's awesome, man. That sounds like a fascinating thing that you did in so many ways. And I like that. Or oh, sorry. First of all, what was that book called that you mentioned? I want to write it down.
tools for teaching conceptual understanding
Tools for Teaching Conceptual Understanding
by Julie Stern.
Okay. Yeah, I was gonna say, oh, sorry, who's the author? By Julie
Stern, Stern. Yep.
Okay. I was going to say that that exercise that you described for media literacy sounds like a good idea for pretty much everyone, because like even for me personally, I try to deliberately consume like media from a broad variety of different perspectives if I can, particularly political perspectives, because that seems to be the thing that people tend to get the most ideological about.
Yeah.
And I do try to sort of do that sort of thing to an extent, but not anywhere near to the extent that you described. Like I do try to think about what narrative is this trying to paint, but I usually don't. Well, actually, no, I guess I kind of do. I do sort of like notice biases sometimes, but I guess you could say I don't actively look for them as much, which probably pushes me towards my own biases to an extent.
Yeah, I mean it's hard, and like I try to be really upfront with my students about this. I'm like, look, I'm not some sort of like objective cipher. Like I don't have all the answers. I am aware of my own biases. I do try to limit how much I share my own ideological viewpoints on things, because for me it's really important to like I want kids to explore and understand their viewpoints. I don't want them to parrot what I think they want me to say. If I do change their mind, I want it to be because they authentically have changed their mind, and not because, they're going to play, I'm going to suck up to the teacher.
Right.
But I do say like, look, like I'm not perfect. Like I have biases. I have, beliefs that I have. And I talk to them about like Dunning-Kruger effect while we're doing that as well, because I have, students who naturally are very opinionated. So Dunning-Kruger is a really nice, kind way for me to say, you're 15 years old. Do you really think you've unraveled the mysteries of the universe? But I can say, is that maybe Dunning-Kruger? Is that maybe a narrative? And like I talk about my own Dunning-Kruger experiences just to be like, look, I'm not above this thing either. But a lot of it, I try really hard to like detribalize my kids, because some of them are, just 15, 16-year-old kids who are like, yeah, politics, it's a thing, but, I'm kind of apathetic to it at this point.
Yeah.
I have a lot of other kids who are really tribalized, like pretty radically tribalized one direction or the other. And I try really hard to just pose to them alternate viewpoints, and give them frameworks where it's not me being like, you're biased, you're wrong, but me asking them questions like, is that a narrative? Or like, how many data points do you have to, support that narrative, that sort of thing. Because when you look at like the standards for what you're supposed to do to teach media literacy to kids these days, I mean, like they're a joke. It's like, make sure you're not on the Wikipedias, and don't use .orgs and .govs, and like make sure that you're not on any GeoCities websites. And I'm like, this thing from 1987, like, the kids just, no one, very few people are equipped, I think, to handle our current like informational paradigm, much less kids. So that, is probably one of the most powerful ones. And, I have some students who are like, my mind is the same, but I had a pretty significant number of kids who are like, some of them took the political compass test at the beginning and the end, and some of them were like, the needle actually moved for me. Like,
Wow.
I'm seeing things differently. I'm sure that there were plenty of others that just continued to dig in, but it's good to know that, some of the conversations I've had with these kids are way more insightful and nuanced and open-minded than a lot of conversations I've had with adults. So it gives me some semblance of hope.
Yeah, that's interesting, because it kind of turns the one of the stereotypes about teenagers anyway on its head. But I mean, like, I've like, from my limited experience with with teaching teenagers, it seems to me too, like like with any age demographic, I guess you could say it kind of depends on the person. But I was thinking as you were talking about that too, that I I kind of wonder if, like, even though teenagers are, I guess, technically close to adults in some ways, they're still like pretty much children from a maturity standpoint. I guess for the most part, there are definitely exceptions to that too. But they, I think that if you're not an adult and you think you have your life figured out and everything like that, maybe
Mhm.
it's easy to be more open to new ideas because you haven't gotten set in your ways in your
Yeah.
career, and like, I'm a Democrat, now I am a Democrat for
Mhm.
life, or I'm a Republican, now I'm a Republican for life, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, like there's no ideological sunken cost fallacy that they're dealing with. Like, and that was we talk about the the agentic state earlier in the year. We're talking about like how like individual people give up or sacrifice power control in their own lives to feel like they are safe, or they understand where they're going, or if there's some sort of political leader that they look up to, they sort of trust them, but they give up some of their own decision making in order to fall into adherence to like what that leader says. And one of the things they talk about is like the importance of consistency, where like the longer you are a member of whether it's a party or like some ideological tribe, the longer you go being consistent with that belief, the harder it is for you to look back and realize the number of years or decades that you've spent on the wrong team, as it were. So, like, I totally think that there's something to that, as a lot of these kids don't, like, they haven't spent all this time, you know, immersed in what they believe themselves to be politically or ideologically. So they're like, oh, well, I kind of thought this, but I just learned about that like a year ago. So it's kind of easy for me to shift, you know, what I believe. Not always the case, but I think more so than with adults.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like if you figured out a year ago, or like if a year ago you decided, I'm an atheist, this God thing is so bullshit, and then like 2 years later you realize, uh well, maybe it's kind of okay for people to be Christians or be religious if they want to, though, and you don't have to go around being an asshole and telling them that they shouldn't believe in God or something like that. Something similar to that happened with me, actually. Although I was probably a militant atheist for about 6 years or so, but I would say I probably started to become one when I was a teenager, and then it wasn't until around the time that I got really into mixed mental arts that that sort of time frame kind of coincided with me basically dropping the militant part of my atheism, and that was like at least 2 years ago now, I guess.
And that was like the coolest thing about mixed martial arts for me was it was a disruptor and a destroyer of orthodoxy.
Yeah,
And like regardless of like political affiliation, I mean, I do have a side that I probably identify with more values and policy wise, but like any type of orthodoxy for me makes me feel hanky. Anytime like being a member of a group becomes like this performative act where like you have to master the language or say things a certain way or behave or act a certain way to fit in, as opposed to just have a set of beliefs, I start feeling uncomfortable. And that's what was so interesting to me about mixed mental arts, was like it was an attempt to just kind of destroy, I guess, like that like very divisive, I mean, we're at a time obviously currently like where politics are so divisive, and it's like total tribe mentality. And it was really powerful to see a group of people that were like, you know, we're all in a tribe, but like, B, let's admit that and then have a conversation about why that happens and how we can be the least tribalized version of ourselves as we can. And to your point about like the kind of rubber band effect, I feel like it's really interesting now to see that. I almost call it like rejection epistemology, where it's like your understanding of the world is based on your rejection of what you used to believe. So it's like what you people used to believe something so strongly that now the only way they understand the world is like through the rejection of that thing. So like I think like Candace Owens, right? Someone like that. Like
oh
I
yeah.
was like a woke SJW, like now I've been like it's the whole red pill thing, right? Like this
Yeah,
idea that you know you once were blind but now you see, but like you only see through, you're seeing through the opposite lens, you know, that you did previously. It's not any
yeah.
sense of like objective reality. You just changed teams, and then you know the whole fact that that becomes a financial boon, adds an extra layer of complication onto that. But and I see
it's
that
sort
with kids
of
sometimes too.
it sort of kind of speaks to the metaphor even more in a way, because if you've taken the red pill, you know that the people you were participating with the enemy. Now you are free from the enemy and you can fight the enemy. They're the bad guys.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely, absolutely. And it's just like, I don't know. I think it's a really kind of interesting thing. I think that there's been like kind of a rise of that recently, where people are like, I have credibility because I previously or currently identify as X, Y, or Z, but now I've updated my paradigm. Like Dave Rubin is like another great example of like, I'm like a classical liberal, but now I'm still a classical liberal, but I have all these ideas that are basically conservative ideas. But I could never be, because I'm a classical liberal. I could never be a conservative, and it's like,
Yeah.
really, like, come on, dude. Like,
I think I've heard him say something about how he still uses that label because he wants to attract more liberals, because he feels like he's attracting too many conservatives who want him to be a conservative. And I think I've seen even him say that his views have gotten more right wing than they used to be.
yeah, I mean, it's all really interesting. Like, and like the lines are shifting so much to the point where like right and left almost are kind of like misnomers to a certain degree, because people can have really different um I guess beliefs or persuasions within that right left framework.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Like there are, well, that's what that's why I probably get I definitely get too annoyed sometimes, if I'm being totally honest. It's funny. I kind of almost get triggered sometimes by people who get triggered. Like like when people are being like really ideologically attached to their political set of views, like as if progressives have the answer for everything always, or as if conservatives have the
Yeah.
answer for everything always. That kind of like almost makes me as pissed off as I see as the level that of pissed off that they seem sometimes.
No, I agree, because like, and for me, it's a level of, it's a lack of curiosity that bothers me the most. Because like for me, I again, I'm not some objective cipher. Like I have like beliefs and persuasions, but I'm much more interested in like asking questions and figuring things out than I am feeling like I have all the answers. Like, and to your point, like when people only view certain issues through a single lens, that bothers me, because like if someone presents to you a new perspective and you immediately reject it out of hand, it's like, are you more interested in finding the answers or feeling as though you hold them? Do you know what I mean? And
Yeah,
it's like it becomes this like almost like this power thing where it's like, hey, here's an alternate perspective, and it's like, well, I'm not even going to consider that, and I'm angry that you would throw this alternate perspective at me, because you're challenging my understanding of the world, and I'm not curious enough to leave my ideological island and go swimming in some questions for a little bit. Like,
yeah,
and even if you return back to your island, at least go test the waters, at least see what else is out there. And for me,
yeah.
what a boring life to just sit on your island and be content that you know all the things.
Yeah. I mean,
But
like, I mean, like, I'm pretty opinionated sometimes, but I always try to be open to having my views change, because the more I learn and the more obsessed I am with learning about so many different subjects, the more often it happens that I realize not necessarily that I'm wrong, but I'm like learn more details about why something is the way it is, or maybe I got this detail wrong over here, and I got this part backwards when I tried to remember it, and I remembered it wrong. And and also I try to be that. I like that attitude of asking questions more too. I try to be that way more, although I could be better at it. And especially like on social media, like I think that's sort of a thing about social media, although definitely there are people who are better at it than me. All as it's as if like I feel myself getting defensive when I don't need to be sometimes when I'm on social media.
Yeah, no,
But
social media does that. I mean, I feel like there are times where, I'll see a post that in my opinion is intentionally trolly or intentionally like baiting or intentionally like ideologically aligned, and like I will feel the snark come out. Like, and like even though I say and I pose like we should be asking questions, we should be doing this, when I feel like someone is, engaging or starting a bad faith argument, sometimes I'm good enough to say like, hey, like, why do you say that? And other times I'm just like, dude, come on, like, really, like, it is hard to do that. And when you're not
yeah,
seeing that person face to face, you lose that empathy piece of like, hey, you're a person and you see the world a certain way for a reason. You just see an avatar and you're like, what you're saying is dumb. And I want you to know that it's dumb, as
yeah.
opposed to like wanting to
Yeah,
understand it.
yeah, exactly.
So,
Oh, I mean, another pet peeve of mine is you mentioned Candace Owens, and one of the reasons that I that I am not a fan of hers is that one of my pet peeves is extreme arrogance in people. Like
yeah,
she is a like it's not people having conservative views that bothers me. Like I understand why some people have conservative views about things, and there are probably some subjects where I lean more towards conservative views than left-wing views. But it's like, regardless of what views we're talking about, if someone is just so arrogant about being right about everything, that just annoys the shit out of me. Like, all these liberals, they're so dumb, and they're just bad people. The Republicans, they're gonna save us all. You
yeah.
should know that if you understood history, because
And that's
I apparently do.
bringing it back to the classroom. That's been kind of a struggle that I've had with some of my students, where I am trying to get them to question whatever they believe. Like there's a quote we always talk about in 1984. Totally blanking. Something to the effect of like, if orthodoxy, like to be orthodox is to be asleep, or to be orthodox is to be dead, something to that effect. Like the idea of like, no matter what your belief or persuasion is, like you need to question it at all times. And I'll have students who like will articulate that they know that, but then we'll be talking about something and they'll throw an idea out there and I'm like, well, that's interesting, like where'd you get that idea? And they're like, oh, like I was watching this Steven Crowder YouTube video. And I'm like, oh, interesting. Like, where else have you like researched that? And they're like, I haven't. Like, but like, the triggered libs were screaming at him, and like he was calm, so he's right. And I'm like, look, like, oh my god, I don't care if you want to, like, if you like whatever you watch on YouTube, that's cool. But like, you can't get and glean your understanding of the world from like one dude's YouTube videos who is literally famous for being a meme. Like
Yeah.
you gotta like triangulate your understanding of the world,
Oh,
but I'll have kids like, well, like you're just saying that because like you don't agree with him or like you don't like him. I'm like, no, like that's not what it is. Like what I want is for you guys like to be intellectually curious, and I want you to say, oh, here's what this person said. I wonder what another person says to counter or rebut that, and it's kind of like um what is it
yeah.
like, I want them, and I obviously don't like couch it to them this way, but like the Hegelian dialectic of like you have one thesis for like how the world works, and then spend some time coming up with an alternate one. Like maybe, and like you're saying earlier about like maybe not completely changing your mind, but updating a few pieces. And I see it like a TV, right? Like when we first start thinking, we're seeing the world in 360p, and then we update and we're at like 480, and then 1080, and like 4K, and the picture keeps getting better and better and better. Even if what we see doesn't totally change, maybe there's some details along the way that we missed or we didn't understand. And it's hard. It's hard to kind of figure that piece out, and kind of going back to the example of the students, like obviously I tell them be skeptical of mainstream media. Like, of course, like, whether it's CNN or Fox News, all media is trying to make money. But then they take that to the extreme and they're like, oh, well, I'm looking at new alternative media. So like because I am watching this YouTuber or that YouTuber, because they aren't beholden to corporate money, which they are, just different groups or entities, like they're like, this means it's legit. So like navigating teaching kids media literacy in this current information paradigm is like wild. It's hard.
Yeah, yeah. It's like you okay, so the the so-called mainstream media, I agree that I don't trust them as news sources, but why why are people skeptical of them as news sources? Because if you do research, you can find that a lot of what they say is wrong. So shouldn't you apply that same mentality to the podcasts that you watch
Yeah,
too? Like
absolutely.
they're just as fallible as mainstream media, aren't they?
Yeah. Yeah, and it's and I get caught in this like catch 22 as I'm talking about this because I want them to question things. And before I really, really leaned into that. But now in the whole era of fake news, like I want them to obviously lean into it, but I'm also afraid like, are we gonna reach a point where like truth just becomes this murky shadow of an idea? And like any student can find a seemingly legitimate source to back up whatever they believe. So it's like at this point now where like I want them to radically question, but like just because there are different interpretations of the truth doesn't mean that they're all equal in terms of like how like well researched they are.
Yeah, yeah. And that's a really difficult thing to figure out too, like to figure out which way the research which direction the research leans, or which direction the preponderance of evidence leans, because like you were saying, basically you can find statistics to support it, to support a lot of different things, like anything almost, like you, especially if you're talking about people who throw statistics at each other in political debates. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of funny when I see anyone do that, regardless of their political identity, because like you can find statistics that say gun control works really well. You find ones that say that it works terribly. Yeah, you can find some climate scientists who say that, global warming is really not a concern at all, and it's just a total hoax invented by the government. But that's probably, like, I don't know, 13 scientists out of like the rest of them, or something like that.
Yeah, and but like that's my concern is that like research is being treated like Pokemon cards now, where it's like
Yeah,
my source does 10 damage to yours, and my source has a higher power level, and it's like we're not concerned with examining
yeah,
them and understanding them. We're like throwing them at each other to like tell other people why they're wrong and why we're right, and there's no real dialogue or dialectic to be had. It's just kind of like a battle of who can come up with the most sources to prove why they are right. It's like curated reality, which is kind of like scary.
yeah, yeah. And the problem with that too is that with this with all of what you can get on the internet, it makes it easy to find just endless mountains of evidence to support your view. I I know someone who I was arguing with about climate change, and because you can find so much evidence to support any position, like he had this endless day. I spent like 3 hours looking up and like researching all of his claims, and finding out that he got a few things right, but kind of got the facts backwards on everything. But like, why did I spend so much time doing this? Like, sometimes there's really not much of a point. Like
Yeah,
you were
and
kind
like
of
sometimes
alluding
we
to
like get
earlier.
gaslighted, right? Like we
Yeah,
like gaslight ourselves. Like is what I believe to be true actually true? And then you go down a rabbit hole to like discover and explore.
yeah, yeah, and yeah, I don't know. Like you were saying, we're probably gonna have to figure out some new ways to navigate in this world. Like I don't think our brains are evolved. We pretty much know that our brains did not evolve to deal with all this constant input, and having your phone all with you all day, like having this supercomputer in your pocket with you all the time. And like you were saying, I can get instant entertainment from my phone anytime. Why should I pay attention in class? And there's I think that's why people are so addicted to technology. Like if I'm taking the bus somewhere, for example. And I do this most of the time too. I'll spend a large chunk of the time on my phone, but then I try to make sure that I spend most of that time reading, like reading an actual physical book. And I'm surprised. I was surprised the other day because I saw three other people reading an actual physical book and not looking at their phones. It seems like an unfortunately kind of rare thing today.
It is. It is. Like technology has come to consume so many other, I guess, entry points and access points to either whether it's ideas or human contact. And it's become this like catch-all thing that we use to connect with each other, to relate to each other, to understand the world, to receive information. I was reading a book recently by Neil Postman called Entertaining Ourselves to Death. And he has this idea in there called the medium is the message. And basically the whole thrust of the novel, and he wrote this in the 90s, which is freaking terrifying considering where we're at now. That like of as we move away from being a typographic society, like one that has to grapple with and understand and navigate, organizational logical text structures to get information. As we move away from that and we move towards really simplified, really performative based, really like shortened bursts of information and communication, eventually what we're going to do is we're going to create this like Twitter epistemology where like the medium is the message. Because the medium is so simplified, it becomes impossible to articulate nuance. Like nuance is lost because the very means through which we communicate and understand the world are shrinking. And like
Mhm.
hearing that, like, it opened a lot of doors for me in terms of like thinking about why there are these problems that we have now in terms of like how we understand things. When you're only understanding these deeply complex, systems of influence and power that exist within modern life, it's like the tools that we have to talk about complex things are decreasing and the complexity of our world is increasing like simultaneously. And that's not bueno for understanding like modern life.
Yeah. Well, and and usually when I talk about the problems of technology, which I seem to be talking about all the time lately, but usually make the point that it's a double-edged sword. Like, for example, in terms of attention spans, yes, there's like texting and Twitter battles and face and arguing with people on Facebook and stuff like that and Snapchat, but then there are also still long form podcasts like what I do basically and like what tons of other people do too. So I guess I'm pretty sure I'm mostly just parroting this line from someone else. I forget who said it, but it's something like there's a thirst for these longer form conversations because of all these things that have short
Yeah.
attention spans. I wonder. I think that's probably some, but not all of the reason that there might be some interest in that.
Yeah, no, I agree. And like obviously the irony of me maligning technology while I'm on a live stream is quite stark.
Yeah.
But like I think it's all about like how it's being used. I don't, and I've had this conversation with my students a lot, and we came to the conclusion, and a student articulated this, and I didn't, which was really cool. Which is like technology doesn't like change or affect human nature; it just amplifies it. So like all of our
Oh
potential
yeah.
for connection and good and like, all of these things that the power of tech is a reflection of our own potential. But at the same time, tech is also the black mirror. Like all of the darkness and the crappiness of humans is exacerbated by technology as well. So it's like thinking about how we use it. And for me, anytime tech can be used in a humanizing way, in a way that gets people empathizing with each other or relating or talking to each other, is healthy. And anything that disrupts or attempts to parody or to profit off of those interactions is negative. And that's the cool thing about like something like podcasts. I actually had my students record a podcast this year for one of their summative activities, and it was their favorite thing they did the whole year. And at first they're kind of like, yeah, like, well, we got to talk about stuff, but they came back and all of them had these like big dumb smiles, because we my school has some pretty cool resources, and like they get to go like in the booth and put on the headset and like, you know, have that authentic experience. But they're also just like, we don't talk about this stuff. We don't have conversations with each other anymore. And like just being able to talk about things that mattered. And they were exploring the relationship between power, empathy, and fear in a few of the texts that we were reading. And they're like, we got to talk about like something that actually matters and is interesting, and we got to have an opinion on it that we could share with people. And like, you know, the way that they talk about this stuff, you think it was like this like lost art of just having a conversation with a human being.
Yeah.
um but it's powerful when they see, you know, how enjoyable that can be. And I think that's why stuff like stuff like this, stuff like podcasts, longer form, quasi face to face, you know, use of tech for me is so much better than the like depersonalized, you know, like Facebook or Twitter, where you're just shooting for updates and, you know, replies or retweets, as opposed to just like talking or relating to someone.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. It's interesting. I think sometimes about how, like, the with podcasts, it's one of the only mediums I can think of where it's just a normal thing to just have a conversation with someone, and it's like, because it's broadcast, like that's why two people would, like, two people who've never met each other before, for example, or two people who have, maybe, would just sit down and have a conversation. Like, in our daily lives, I don't think that's such a common thing anymore, although definitely
Yeah.
people do like sit and have conversations sometimes. But like, with me, for example, if I'm having a conversation with someone, it's like if I'm hanging out and going for a walk with my friend or something like that, or maybe I'll go and sit down and have a conversation with one if I go and get a cup of coffee or something like that. But it seems like, at least it's more of a norm today, I guess I would say, with than it used to be, related to primarily technology again, to just not make this a thing where like you go and have a conversation with someone. Like, it's I think it's probably, it seems common to me anyway, for, although I don't do this with my friends as much, but I've seen it happen before. Like, people go to hang out, and then they like play video games and don't really talk to each other, or maybe they'll like go to watch it, or they'll watch a movie and then like both be in their phones the whole time or something like
Yeah.
that. Like, that sort of interaction seems more common.
Yeah, I mean, it totally is. And I think a lot of it is about like intentionality. Like when you're on a podcast, you're there to share and articulate your ideas.
Yeah.
You know, when you're going to, you know, hang out with people, typically there's some sort of like pretense for it. Like we're gonna go to the bar, or we're gonna go to the movies, or we're gonna go to dinner, and they're like, you know, there are time limits, and there are all these like, you know, weird interpersonal rules, like no politics or religion at the dinner table. Whereas like you're gonna get on a podcast and talk about religion and politics like intentionally.
Yeah.
Um, but I think that like those like, you know, weird, crappy social rules, the negative aspects of tech that are depersonalizing and dehumanizing in terms of how we interact with people, it's left people really hungry for connection and for dialogue and for conversation. And I think that's why podcasts are so powerful, because like, you know, people kind of crave the opportunity, the ability to just kind of like let down their guard and have a conversation with each other. Over the course of my year, I have like 5 or 6 Socratic seminars, which is like our classes are pretty long, like an hour, 45 minutes. And like the desks will be circled up, and the kids will have, you know, questions or post-it notes or whiteboards that they've kind of like scribbled notes down on, and we'll just talk about books, current events, stuff we've been talking about in class. And it'll be like an hour and 45 minutes of no one touching their phone, nobody doing anything but just sitting across from each other and having a conversation. And my students, like, almost to a T. I have a few like really introverted kids who like their brains are gonna explode because they have to talk to people. But most of them are like, it is so powerful to just sit in a big circle and just talk to people. And like there's someone who has a different viewpoint than mine, and I get to hear them talk about it. And like I wasn't concerned with young and telling them why they're wrong. I just get to hear this kid share their story, and it was really cool and powerful. And I think that like kids are really hungry for that. And I think that's something that like in our curriculum, when it comes to like figuring out what is the school of tomorrow, how can education change and keep up with the times, like education needs to be more humane. I don't mean that in like a torturous way. I mean like it needs to be a place in a space where we can like explore and talk about our humanity in an engaging way, because robots and algorithms and computers are taking over a lot of that more I guess rote linear computational thinking. And like, what do we do with those numbers now, right? We need to understand, what do people need?
Yeah, exactly. Like that's basically the idea of the word Socratic that you use. Like that used to be what the idea of learning was actually like
Yeah.
people having conversations with each other and discussing ideas, and there don't need to be any like tests or papers or anything like that necessarily. That reminds me of when when I was in college a few years ago in my philosophy class. We had 2 classes a week, and the first class of each week was him giving us a lecture and us taking notes and asking questions, basically. And then every second class every week, we would arrange the desks into a circle and do exactly that, what you were describing. Basically,
Yeah.
have a conversation about what we had learned the previous day and try to understand it better and give our opinions about it, and like actually talking about ideas, which is a really good way to learn about them, especially for probably particularly more extroverted people, but maybe students, and I think perhaps students in general as well, because you're actually like connecting with someone, perhaps connecting on the basis of being confused about an idea too, and then you can kind of all try to understand it together.
Yeah, and like something that's interesting that's come out recently is so John Hattie is an educational researcher who does like meta-analyses of education, like educational methods for effect size. So it's basically like, how can you I guess quantify how effective or useful an educational method is. And classroom conversation, Socratic dialogue, small group discussion are like three. They're not like the tippy top, but they are in, I think, the top 15 most effective ways to learn and to encode information, which is kind of crazy to think about, because I think that a lot of teachers be like, "We're just gonna have kids sit around and talk about stuff." Yeah, that's like according to a bunch of research shows that's how people learn. One of the ways people learn really well.
Well, that's what people do about subjects that they're interested in, right? And people tend to remember information about stuff that interests them. Like if 2 teenagers are like talking at lunchtime or something like that, and they're talking about this awesome video game that they both love playing, they're probably going to remember details about the video game later. So it's that aspect from straight A conspiracy again, like trying to get people interested in what is actually happening. And I can totally see how presenting it in that way can make it much more accessible to people.
And that's what's been really powerful, going back to what I was saying earlier about like the conceptual understanding book that I was reading, is when you have a broader concept that you can present or frame material around, it makes finding those entry points and leveraging students' background knowledge so much easier. So like when we're talking about power, that's kind of our big discussion over the course of the year. And what better entry point than talking about Thanos and the Avengers? So like, we will talk about this concept through a medium that they really enjoy and like and understand, which is like, what does Thanos think, feel, believe about power? And then
Oh,
based on
that's
that, they can start
fascinating.
seeing that, yeah, come up in all these other contexts. So it's basically like weaponizing their background knowledge to understand more complex texts. That's kind of what I'm doing with the Black Mirror episodes. So like we're talking about like what ways technology disrupts communication and relationships, and they're reading about it in nonfiction sources, but then they're also watching an episode of Black Mirror as a way to kind of like get them to understand the background knowledge, so they can access the more complex ideas. So it's like when you have that broad organizing concept that you're presenting material around, it's a lot easier to leverage kids, prior understanding. So like last
Yeah.
year when I was doing Beowulf, and we were talking about culture, I talk to the kids about like Skyrim, because like what better entry point to like Anglo-Saxon literature than talking about the video game Skyrim, and all the kids like, oh my god, like these are kind of similar themes, and like these heroes have kind of similar traits and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And I think that so much of what we do is like we tell kids like, this is for your well-being, like trust me children, this education, this academia is very to your benefit, and the kids like are externally like, yeah sure, but internally they're like, yeah screw you dude, like when am I gonna need to know how to use this? So like being
Yeah.
more honest about like and intentional about what's the utility, and like part of the powerful thing about conceptual understanding is it leads to something called learning transfer. So like it's actually like there's cognitive science behind the fact that if you talk about things on a conceptual level, not on a fact level, it's easier to transfer. So like students can, if you talk about like what are the relationships between systems of power and identity in this TV show, they can then take that knowledge and apply it and understand it in a different book, in a different movie. Whereas opposed to just teaching someone about like one story or one instance where that happened, facts and topics don't transfer, but like those big concepts do. So the kids are like, they'll be like, Mr. Ellie, like you've ruined Netflix, because now I'll watch a show or a movie and I'll be like, oh, it's just Lord of the Flies. It's talking about chaos and order and depersonalization. Or they'll be like, they'll tell me whatever Netflix or HBO show they're watching, and they're like, this is talking about systems of power. This is talking about chaos and order. And it's kind of funny to see like it kind of like infect their brain when
Yeah.
they engage with other media.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, totally. And that makes a lot of sense too, because like when I'm talking about something like a book I just read and something I just learned from that book, sometimes I remember exact numbers and statistics if it's just fresh in my mind and I read the book like last week or something like that. But normally all the times after that I'm talking about that particular book or thinker or something like that, I basically just remember the general concepts, and
Yeah,
that's basically like what people end up talking about in reality. Like in I mean, I guess that people do debate statistics sometimes, but even in like political debates or something like that, unless it's like an actual formal debate like Intelligence Squared or something like that, people most of the time don't really seem to debate statistics that much. They seem to basically debate the concepts.
yeah. I mean, and you could really boil a lot of our current political debates like around those sort of like concept. The ideological conflict is really a discussion or argument about different concepts,
Yeah.
like what like it's like the spectrum of chaos versus order, right? Like you could argue like chaos is the free market, right? Like no holds barred, people figure it out, do or die, the cream rises to the top, right? And something more like bigger government, right, is more about order, but with order you could have potential like stagnation. And it's kind of like these people are viewing ideologies through this single conceptual lens, and that leads them to either think that it is God's gift to everything, or that it is like the enemy, like the whole like Jonathan Haidt thing about I don't remember the exact quote, like naive realism, like thinking that
Oh,
you
yeah.
are ideologically pure and what you believe is right. I think that like we get trapped in a single story, we get trapped focusing on a single concept, like only thinking about freedom, which is like great, but like there are other idea concepts within that ideology that maybe like freedom is there, but what else is there?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and once you learn that concept of naive realism, you see it fucking everywhere with everyone
Yeah,
all the time.
yeah,
And if you try hard enough with yourself sometimes too. But it's just so easy to notice in people. And I'm not trying to say this in a disparaging way. I'm just saying it because it's like a human thing. It's basically
absolutely.
being human, to be like, this is the way I see the world. Everyone else sees the way the world I do, therefore their opinion is illogical. But really, they probably see the world differently than you do. So according to their worldview, it's logical and yours is illogical. Like, there are lots of different worldviews that they all feel logical to us. And like Jonathan Haidt talks about the we're all intuitive in our thinking. We start with an intuition and then we rationalize from that. We're not rational human beings. We're emotions, and it's all based in our feelings. So when we're talking about logic, it's how we feel about how logical we're being.
Yeah, and that's something that I bring to my students a lot, is that idea of like, we are feeling creatures that think, not just thinking creatures that feel. And that a lot of them, especially like my like male students, are like they're very much on, they're like, no, but like my facts don't care about your feelings, like that whole tip. And it's like, no, like, facts obviously are important, because some of the stuff I'm tasked with teaching them is like the rhetorical triangle, like ethos, pathos, logos, and understanding like what bias and persuasion looks like, and like understanding that like all facts are presented within emotional frames. So it's like, yeah, sure, like facts, like we do need to consider and count on facts, but the way that they are presented and leveraged, especially during a debate, there's always an emotional context there that's going to color their perception and affect the way that you kind of like think about and engage with them. And I don't know, I think that's kind of like something that we don't really talk about a lot, because like the assumption is education is just about like giving kids facts, right? We don't really give them a framework or a context to think about how their emotion colors or affects the facts that they're intaking.
Yeah, totally. And it's funny too, because you can tell people's feelings getting really hurt sometimes by by even the suggestion that feelings can be involved with facts, because it's too close to
Yeah,
it's too close to saying that there are no facts. It's just all relative. It's just all how you feel about
exactly.
it, which
Yeah.
is not really what anyone is trying to say. It's just that yes, there are facts, but when we learn facts, we're in a certain emotional state, and we interpret those facts based on our preconceptions, and everyone does that, even scientists who make these scientific breakthroughs. It doesn't mean that their facts are wrong. It means that it's important to think about how they are interpreted.
Yeah, and that's why I think you were the one who posted the Rick Roderick philosophy series. Was that you
Yeah,
a few months ago?
yeah.
Yeah, and I loved his idea of fallibilism.
Oh,
The
yeah.
Yeah, I thought that was like awesome. The idea that like you cannot know anything for sure, and that's not cynicism. It's not like saying that like it's impossible for anyone to know anything. It's that there you always leave room for your mind to be changed, even if you passionately believe something.
Yeah.
And because I'm annoying, I made it a big show this year to reveal my ideological bias to my students, because they're always asking like, "Are you like Republican or conservative or whatever?" And I'm like, at the end of the unit, it's like, guys, I'm going to reveal my ideology to you. Like, I'm finally going to tell you. And like, what is it? And I wrote on the board like, I'm a fallibilist. And they're like, what? And I'm like, yeah. I'm like, it means that I don't even know if what I believe is totally right all the time. And they're just like, dude, we hate you.
Yeah.
But like for me, that's such a good way to be, because like it's not cynicism, but it's acknowledging that there will always be new data that you need to intake and update, your paradigm, no matter like what your beliefs are. And like my personally, ideologically, I have kind of like swung from where I was when I was like in high school and college to where I am now. And it's like the more attention that I've paid to things, the more the stories that I once held on to understand the world, I realized that there are other better stories that align more with, the research that I've done and the people that I spoke to that have expertise.
Hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. And yeah, that term fallibilism is great. I try to be that way too. Like, that basically is the way I am. Like, I'm not 100% sure about everything. That doesn't mean I think that everything is all relative. Like, there are
Yeah.
tons of things that I'm maybe 90 or even 95% sure about, but I'm still always open to, even the possibility of some fucking crazy things. Like, yeah, it is theoretically possible that maybe I could fly someday. I think it's phenomenally unlikely though. And yeah, I first heard that term fallibilism from Hayden Bruce, who is in mixed mental arts and has that Pragmatic Christian podcast. I actually connected with him before I got involved in the mixed mental arts community, because that was around the time when it was before I started my YouTube channel, and I was just mostly writing blogs on my blog about ideas like psychology and Jonathan Haidt, and how like how and why I dropped the militant part of my atheism, and how that was partially related to like Jonathan Haidt's The Righteous Mind, for example, and these ideas of group selection that from mixed mental arts and Jonathan Haidt, about how religion may have been evolved for good reasons because the religious metaphors have some psychological utility. And
Yeah.
so we connected at that point, because it was at a point when I was like I was saying I'm an atheist, but I'm open to people being religious, and I have no problem with people being religious. So he connected with me because I was open to religion, and he's a Christian, and he was kind of coming from the opposite direction in a sense, because he was in he was kind of like almost an evangelical who was going to go on missions at one point, and then he gradually became less religious to now he's still identifies as a Christian, but he's extremely open with people who are not religious like me. So that's why we connected a long time ago. And I heard, like I said, I first heard that term fallibilism from him because he has a profound interest in pragmatic philosophy, and that's a term from pragmatism.
Yeah, I keep meaning to check out his stuff because that's something that I found really interesting. It's like how one can reconcile a desire for inquiry and to think about things in a philosophical nature, and hold that in one hand, and then also holds like the tenets of religion in the other. Because I think that that is something that we assume can't be done, but it can. Like religion. Um, so much of what I guess we perceive religion to be is like this, socially constructed idea, and like it can kind of be what you want it to be. And I think that's, obviously within certain parameters of the faith. But I've been wanting to kind of check out his thoughts on that because that's something that sort of appealed to me. Because I grew up in a Christian household, but it was never like foisted or forced upon me to the point where I felt like the need to like reject or rebel against it. But I don't know. It's a really complex thing, and I think that um, people, whether they are finding that sweet spot, whether you are Christian or atheist, people who just are interested and curious and want to discuss and share ideas. It sounds like that's a pretty powerful thing that he's doing, just like wanting to connect with people who aren't religious and just have a conversation with them, not proselytize to them or change them, but just be like, here's what I think. What do you think? And I think we
Yeah,
need more conversations like that, not just, in religious spaces, but in
yeah,
political spaces, educational spaces. Like we just need more people who are profoundly interested in sharing ideas, not selling or proselytizing or pitching something, just exchanging ideas.
yeah, yeah. And I mean, um, yeah. If you're interested in the spirit of that, we did a series of conversations both on my YouTube channel and on Hayden's podcast between me, him, and Sam's Bulldog, or Ed Kennedy, and he's a huge fan of Sam Harris, and he's a militant atheist. So we did kind of a series of conversations with all of us talking about ideas like morality and faith and evidence and science and stuff like that. And it was interesting because I'm kind of in between Hayden and Ed. He's more, like I said, he's a militant atheist. I'm sort of like I would say, kind of a fallibilistic atheist, and then Hayden is a Christian, but he's not like a hardcore Christian or anything like that. So it was interesting to kind of talk out our different perspectives on issues like that. And then on Hayden's podcast, of course, too, he does have he has people on to talk about different sort of philosophical viewpoints in combination with religion, and he's had people on there like basically people who have come out of like fundamentalist communities and are trying to figure out how to sort out their faith, and because they feel like they're having an identity crisis because they were so involved with groups like that.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that that's part of the problem that we see with the tribal divisive nature of politics now. And I don't remember the entirety of the article, but there's something about like how like politics is sort of becoming our religious identifier. Like as religion is sort
Yeah,
of like fading to the background, we're desperately in search of some sort of connection or tribe like through which we can understand ourselves in and within. And politics is kind of offering that to a lot of people, which considering all of the behind the scenes machinations and manipulation of our government or Wall Street or whatever, like it's a mess because you're taking those tribal switches that were they were flipped by religion, but like it was like I don't know, I guess it's the same sort of mechanisms, but new people are flipping those switches, but we're not even necessarily aware that it is and has become the new religion. We don't think about our political identity the way that we do our religious identity, because at least with religion there was the ostensibly the idea that you're helping people and that there's a moral position within it. And I feel like that's kind of been sucked out of a lot of political discussion
I
nowadays, but
think
yet they still have the diehard tribalism.
I think that some of that is that it almost like politics almost literally has been replaced in that way. It, at least when we're talking about the extremes, like I have like I know someone like that person I mentioned earlier who is like basically like kind of far right views on everything, and then I also have a family member who has he basically has like radical progressive positions on everything, and I find with both of them when I'm talking to them, it really seems like they are almost literally religious. Like
Mm.
they have a moral framework and a moral hierarchy, and like this is right, this is wrong, these are the good people, these are the bad people, this is what is happening, we know the truth, we know the way.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's because like modern life is so complex, and we're all desperately searching for ways and means to create and make meaning.
Hmm.
That when you find that framework that gives you a sense of control and mastery over your life and your understanding of the world, you cling to it. It's scary to sort of like I could see how it could be scary to feel ideologically cut adrift, to admit and acknowledge that you don't understand things, because some people need or desire that control. And extreme ideological frameworks, whether it's a right or left framework, gives people the ability to feel as though they are in control. And I think that like where people desperately need to feel in control, and they also need to feel like they have a sense of meaning. So that could go from like the good guy bad guy mentality as well.
Yeah. And the like for me, one of the key aspects of that is that you can have meaning in a lot of different ways. It doesn't have You don't have to find meaning from basically just this political identity. And like you were saying, it is a way that people can get tribal. So it's a good way to replace religion if you want to do that. And then but then like there are so many other things that you can derive meaning from, and it doesn't have to be this whole like worldview. Like but like and not everyone is the same as me, for example, but a lot of people are, I'm sure, in that I like to get meaning from a lot of other different things. I like to practice sort of that Bruce Lee quote that they talk about in mixed mental arts. Take what is useful, ignore what
Yep.
is not, and make it uniquely your own. So I kind of like to just find meaning in like a variety of different religions and a lot of different a lot of different novels and stuff like that, and learning from important thinkers like Jonathan Haidt, and so, and meaning from creative expression and writing and all sorts of stuff like that. And it can be hard to figure it out, but and people should do what they want to. But I think that just it's I don't know, I guess that was my long-winded way of saying that it's just it's difficult to do, but there are lots of different ways to do it.
No, I agree, and I think that like that it reminds me of that, like the TED talk, like the danger of a single story. Like if there's only one story through which you craft and construct meaning, you're missing out on so many different perspectives and ideas. And um, in my last unit, the last 10-15 minutes of class, if students wanted to continue what we were talking about in a Socratic seminar, I did call it what I called like ongoing carpet conversations, where like they'd pull up like a chair, we just like sit in a circle, and they could have a little bit more time to discuss the ideas we were exploring in our seminar while other students got ahead on their reading. And like
Oh,
one of the conversations got really like deep, and a kid was like Monsieur, like how do I live like a purpose driven life? And I'm like, uh, above my pay grade. I'm like a 28-year-old public high school teacher, so like I don't have the mysteries of the universe. But the best I could come up with was like throwing that quote, that the Bruce Lee quote from Mixed Mental Arts. Like whatever you do, find meaning within it. I don't care if you're like drawing a picture, if you're like an artist or an athlete or whatever. Like it's kind of up to I'm a big believer that like systems and structures affect a lot of things, but like for me, it's always up to the individual to construct meaning for their life. And the more ways that you can find, the more activities or tasks or things you can do that you find meaningful and that you can build meaning from, I feel like the better of a human being you'll be. Because we were, the conversation had pivoted from talking about like Winston and talking about like, well, like how did Winston derive any purpose or meaning from his life in 1984? When like, he had no control, he had no ability to make meaning. And then they kind of said that like, we feel like Winston sometimes because we're just like going through life like beholden to like school or our parents or whatever. Like, so like, in the limited freedom that we have, how can we build meaning from that? And I love that quote because I think it kind of is just like, it's up to you, man. Like you figure that out. But like that's the journey, like is
yeah.
figuring out how to
And I
construct meaning and what to do with it.
And I think part of the problem with that too is that there are lots of things that people find meaning in that they feel guilty about. Like you're not supposed to find meaning in like that. Like what? Like I wish I had known that when I was a teenager. Because when I was a teenager, I found meaning in like reading books and playing video games, and I kind of thought there was something wrong with that because like you're not going to grow up to do this as a career or anything like that. So why should it be so important to you? And that wasn't even a message that was enforced on me and my parents, because I actually had really good parents and a really good upbringing, but it was just this message enforced on me by just culture at
Yeah.
large, that it's not okay to like find meaning in things that you just do for fun. Like you need to find meaning in something that's important and ambitious and something like that. But if teenagers or just people in general were okay with finding meaning in doing things that they like to do, then that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, and I see that like it for my students especially. I think that idea is pretty profound because I'm in like the Washington D.C. suburban sprawl. So like most of my students, we're like really pretty diverse school, but most of them are fairly socioeconomically well off. So like they live in like a pressure cooker of I have to get the grades, I have to get the GPA, I have to get the top 10 in the class, I have to go to the good college, I have to get the good job. And they just are obsessively running on this hamster wheel, and they don't stop and think about meaning because they're so obsessed with getting the next thing. But they're miserable, they're isolated, they compete against each other even though they don't want to. They're within this um, you know uh, educational paradigm that is like this built on the scarcity model that some of you will make it and some of you won't. So don't ever encourage or cheer on your neighbor because they could take your spot at the Ivy League school you want to go to. And it's just kind of like this miserable thing where we don't ever talk about those big why questions. We don't ever talk about like you know, how a kid asking an adult, like, what can I do to find purpose and meaning in a place that's meant to educate children? That shouldn't be a surprising question to hear. But it is, because we're too busy, you know, running them through the dog and pony show of what education is supposed to be for the last 150 years. And it's like, I don't know, our priorities are all skewed up and screwed up. But as long as there's a financial incentive for there to be these big, you know, like testing corporations and companies, and you know, these people who are just pumping out these educational products, it's hard. I think it's going to be hard to combat and come back to what education is supposed to be, because
Yeah.
like at the end of the day, like, you know, the almighty dollar kind of dictates things, and education as a commodity is something that doesn't work out well, in my opinion.
And the sort of ironic aspect of that to me is that I bet if you I maybe studies about this have already been done, but I bet if you did studies and you found and you compared like kids who thought they had meaning and then kids who were just kind of just stuck up in the rat race, and you compared how they did later in life. I wonder if you would find that I bet you would find that the ones who felt like they had meaning probably did better in life overall. And
Yep.
if you could show that, then it could like realistically it could create a financial incentive to have that as a motivation when you're developing these young, like with the idea that you're developing these young minds into becoming people who are living their lives in the world. You're not just trying to get them to do well on these tests.
Yep, and it's funny that you say that. There have been studies
Oh,
that
okay.
have come out very recently that say that if the higher your GPA is, or not, maybe not the higher. Oh, sorry, I was pulling up the article and an ad came up. Valedictorians are not nearly as likely to be successful as people who are like 10 to 15 to 20 ranks lower than them within their class, because they are good at playing the game and following rules, and they are good at doing things that don't really have as much utility in the corporate or public space, which is crazy, because you're like, oh, obviously the valedictorian is going to go on to make the most money, to be the most successful. More and more research is saying that's not the case. And there's this speech that I showed to my students about this girl who she's at like one of like a top like prep school, or boarding school or something, like one of the top ones in the country. She has her pick of any of the Ivy League schools, and she's like giving her valedictorian speech, and she's like, I might be the top of the class. I might have the best grades. The teacher might know my names. I might have the most academic prestige. But she's like, but I have no idea who I am, and I have no idea where I'm going. And for all of the kids who missed a homework assignment to go to a party, or were able to go to prom because they weren't thinking about the 8 projects they had, she's like, I am jealous, because you know who you are, and I might have all of the accolades. I might have all of the ribbons, but like, I don't know who I am, and I don't know where I'm going, and college terrifies me because I don't know those things. And I was just like, damn, like that is
Wow.
powerful to hear from a kid who is that reflective, because they know. Oh, you talk to them, most of them know that it's a rat race, and most of them, you know that it sucks and it prevents them from pursuing things that have real meaning. But not all of them are willing to step off the you know, the gerbil wheel and to think about them.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I wonder if part of that is because when you're if you're just going through life doing what you think you're supposed to do,
Mhm.
then maybe you're not that good at figuring out how to do things yourself, or more importantly, figuring out what to do if you actually have the choice of what you should do. So it kind of makes sense to me that that sort of mindset would make you like lead to you feeling lost and having a lot of trouble figuring out where you're going to go in life.
Yeah, because I mean, like, you know, no one is going to tell you, like, when you leave academia, like, sure, your boss is going to give you like taskers, but no one's going to like tell you, how to spend every single moment of your day. Nobody's going to give you a worksheet to figure out who you want to be or where you want to go, or what your passions in life are. And I think that we like really do kids a disservice where we send them out into the real world with this ream of facts and knowledge that doesn't transfer to anywhere. And they're just like, what do I do with all this stuff? I've been given all of these useless bits and bytes of data and knowledge, but like I've never learned how I can leverage it in any meaningful way. And it's my Generation Z, the word that most of them pick to describe their most common emotional state is either loneliness or isolation.
Oh,
So it's
wow.
like, as they're competing against each other and as they lack meaning, like they all are feeling like isolated. And for me, it's such a tragedy that these kids are like crying out for meaning or connection or authenticity. And we are like, here, kid, look at this worksheet and write down a bunch of terms and facts and figures. You might be like lost and scared and alone in the world and not know where you're going to like, who you're going to be or what you're going to do, and anxious and depressed, but like at least how to like what a polynomial is or something.
Yeah. Oh, that's funny. One of my last students I was teaching, we were actually learning about exactly that, polynomials. That's one of the things that he was having trouble with.
But
And
the other thing that go ahead.
I was just saying that like similar to what you were saying about it, like having a pass tests and know this information and stuff like that. He had trouble with that too, because he, like me when I was in high school, did really badly in math and was failing because he had no interest in it. And like one of the ways that I was trying to encourage him is that it's not just that you have to do good on this test. It's that if you if you don't focus on trying to learn how to do these questions now, then you'll have to do it again next semester. So might as well just put more effort into it now, so you don't have to do it again. Like that's not necessarily a broad goal, but even that sort of motivated him at least a little bit, because he hates math, so he doesn't want to do it twice as much as he needs to.
Yeah, and like I mean, just to like contradict, what I was saying, like because sometimes when I feel like when I put that message out there about like what's the utility of what we're learning, I feel like a lot of kids take that to the extreme and they're just like, well, school is pointless and nothing that we learn has any use or utility, and like like what we shouldn't be doing it, or like kids should just be like learning by themselves or whatever. And I think like that's like the opposite end of the extreme, where like if it's presented and couched in a certain way, everything that we learn has the potential to be leveraged in a new context, as long as it's presented in a way that makes it transferable. And like school is a great teacher for so many, like learning how to learn, learning how to persevere, learning how to think logically, learning how to interact with your peers. And I do get nervous a lot of times where I see people be like, we don't need facts anymore because you can just Google things. And it's like,
Yeah.
that's true to a point, but like in order to be creative or to have expertise, you have to know facts. Like, I don't mean until we reach a point of like total singularity where you can just take information and download it into your brain. Like, in order to be creative, in order to be an expert, in order to think deeply, you have to know stuff. You can't just rely on everything to be on your phone.
Mhm.
It's kind of hard to like find that balance between like acknowledging the fact that a lot of what we do in school is this kind of like dog and pony show to get through, but also on the same, or on the other hand, acknowledging that like there can be and there is utility in school in a traditional sense. Like I don't think that replacing teachers with robots, obviously I'm biased, but is going to be good, because then we're just like we're just doubling down on the industrial model of education, but it looks better because there are robots or
Yeah.
computers.
Yeah, like in terms of what you were saying of looking everything up, I mean, like we were talking about earlier, if you just learn those little bits of information when you have to, you're probably not going to remember them, because it's not usually some sort of conceptual thing, or maybe it's like 2 lines from Wikipedia, which you'll probably forget tomorrow. And it's like if you learn like from a book about a whole concept or something like that, instead of just looking up a bunch of facts, you're probably going to remember more because you're just going to be learning concepts and how they relate to each other than if you just look something up, because it'll be more meaningful because you'll have more context. Like if you have no context there,
Yep.
then it's not as important to remember it. And my uncle was a chemistry professor, and he retired a few years ago. And he was saying that he got out of the education system just as the right time, because he was noticing exactly that when he was teaching kids, they would just look up the answers on their phone all the time. And he said their memories were getting worse because of that. And he was saying, yeah, you can look it up, but you need to remember the information for the test. You're not going to be able to look it up on your phone when you're doing the test.
Yeah, and like when you're giving a presentation or you're writing a pitch or are doing something, you're not going to be able to pause the meeting and pull out your phone
Yeah,
and Google, it is what you were thinking about or looking up. And I think that like that is like a really common misconception out there, that like facts have no utility at all because Google exists. But no, they have
yeah,
utility, but to your point, only if they are presented in a way that allows them to be transferred. And like that contextual piece, I feel like is so important, because I feel like so much education is lacking a context, and it's just like this decentralized scattershot of facts and figures. But concepts give them, the students, sort of a conceptual framework that they can orient different facts in. And like a super oversimplified picture of our brain is like schema, is like the organizational neural networks that we have that store and encode information. So like when you have, or when you're equipping kids with like these conceptual schema, all the different bits and bytes of knowledge can kind of fit within that framework. So it allows them to understand ideas in a longer term way. Because then when those neurons start firing, it's not just this one little tiny neuron of this one factor figure, it's this whole neural network that is like that conceptual framework. But yeah, it's been cool to kind of have conversations with my students where they're pulling in conversations about concepts we talked about way earlier in the year, even if they don't necessarily remember the exact article or short story that we read to relate it to. So
yeah, yeah. That's good. That's great. Yeah, exactly. That's a good a better way of putting it too. Explaining that you you can light up like an entire neural network or something like that if you learn the context of the information. Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah. I can't think of anywhere else to go with this for now. But is there anything else you want to talk about?
um I feel like we did a pretty good job weaving in and out of mixed mental arts and how it applies to education. And there's always more to think about it, but I feel like we did a pretty good job exploring our current line of discussion. Anything else that you wanted to hit on?
No, no, not really at the moment. But yeah, thanks for talking with me, man, and I'd be glad
Yeah,
to
absolutely.
talk to you again too. I'm sure there's lots of other topics that we could talk about. And
Absolutely.
yeah, all right. So I'll just say all the stuff that I like to say at the end of my episodes, and then you can offer any plugs or any last words there.
Go for it.
All right. So thanks to everyone for watching this episode of the Mindgasms podcast. Hope you found it as interesting as we did. And thanks so much to everyone who shares this video, and to those of you who subscribe to my channel, and especially to those of you who contribute to me on Patreon. I really appreciate that. And I'll add a link for that in the description for this video, like I always do. And like I always say, I love you all. Keep being the tiny beam of light that shines through the almost impenetrable darkness in the universe. And most importantly, always remember this: the funk cures all. All right, keep having mindgasms, everyone. And any plugs or last words there, Trevor?
No, I don't think I could top that outro. I guess you can follow me at Mr. Aleo Says, and I kind of write about my journey of education on the website in search of Scala.com. So yeah, thanks for having me on, man. I appreciate it. It's a great chat.
Okay, yeah, I'll add those links to the description of the video. Thanks, man.
Cool. No
And
problem.
yeah, all right, and all right. Have a good night, everyone. Adios. Until next time.